I think we need to get going. So again, so formally and finally, on behalf of Part SA, everyone welcome, particularly to our guest speakers who are here this evening as well. It is an absolute privilege to have you join us in this space, and yeah, we are all keenly looking forward to your presentations. And I now hand you over to the capable hands of Pierre, who's done all the hard work in putting this evening together and negotiating and inviting and seducing all of the presenters to be here this evening. Pierre, we're in your hands.
Thanks, Ron, and hi, everybody. Just to answer Stanley's question in the chat, Stanley, for those of us who are registered with professional bodies where we require continuing professional development, we need to get points, and this meeting's tonight will qualify for points. So we need to record people's professional registration numbers at the beginning, at the end, to show that they attended. So it probably doesn't apply to you, I think, as a law person. So yes, thanks everybody for being here this evening. My name is Pierre. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I work at the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. I'm also on the board of Path SA. I'm a member of the Sexuality and Gender Division of the Psychological Society's executive. And I've worked in the fields of HIV, sexualities, and gender for, wow, way too long, since the sort of late 1980s when the first dinosaurs were being made extinct. And I think the question of working with and thinking about trans and gender diverse people and identities has definitely come to the fore a lot more in my own work in the last few years. And it isn't just an intellectual issue for me, but in my own sort of life journey, I think I have come to understand myself as gender questioning, if you like. And so I certainly have recollections. Tonight's session is about school, of feeling not comfortable in an all-boys school environment. So I have sort of a personal investment in some ways in tonight's topic. I'd just like to also, before we begin formally this evening, mark the passing of Eusebius McKaiser, who many of you may have known as a prominent public intellectual in South Africa. Eusebius passed away rather suddenly today, and he was a fierce political commentator and an amazing debater and provocateur in some ways, but in my own personal interactions with him personally was always incredibly warm and friendly, and it's quite a sad moment that he has gone. So the title for tonight's session is called Gender Inclusive Schools, A Fine Balance, and it's about thinking about the gender diverse child in a school context when it's possible that there's a conflict between how the school wants to manage a young person who's becoming more open about being gender diverse, and if the child is in some way, or the young person, anxious or concerned about whether they should A, tell the school and how the school could respond, and B, whether or not they have told their parents. You know, obviously, if a child is trans or gender diverse and is thinking about transitioning at some point, they would need, certainly as a child, if they wanted puberty blockers as a young person, they would need the involvement of their parents. South Africa's consent laws are quite liberal and progressive around, for example, a young person of 12 or older can consent to a termination of pregnancy, to some medical treatment, an HIV test. So there's already sort of precedent, in a sense, for a certain amount of agency and a recognition of that by our constitution. And but I think when it comes to trans teens and accessing puberty blockers and possibly moving as an older teen or an early adult into say surgeries, then parental guidance and involvement is clearly a factor. But clearly they have to be involved. We all know at the moment, if we're looking at the United States, that there's a lot of moral panic and social control and legal control aimed at young people, and attempts to prevent, in fact, parents in any way from allowing young people to take, for example, puberty blockers or have any form of gender affirming therapies and support. So there's a real shift to the right in the United States. And some of that sentiment, I think, has bled over into the African context and even into the South African context. And you hear people in different forums talking about young people being groomed or being inappropriately put on almost on a conveyor belt, which has an inevitable endpoint of surgery. And I think it is so much more complex than that. And I think the core issue that I thought we could debate tonight and with our panel is what do we do when a young person indicates to the school that they want to socially transition, for example, but and they say to the teacher or the person that they've spoken to, assuming the school is, of course, welcoming and positive, and there are some of those instances already happening. What if they say to the teacher or the person they've spoken to, please don't tell my parents. They wouldn't approve, they wouldn't support my transitioning, even if it at a social point of view. They are hostile to my being gender questioning. The school is caught in a little bit of a double bind. They have to involve the parents in many ways because it is right and proper often to involve the parents in important decisions for the child. But at the same time, they want to be mindful of the young person's position if they feel that they would face some kind of stigma and discrimination or outright harm and rejection from their parents. So I think this isn't a simple question to solve. And so I had asked the panelists to bring some of their thoughts to this issue. We have quite progressive draft guidelines, which are called the Guidelines for the Socio-Educational Inclusion of Diverse Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, Expression, and Sex Characteristics in Schools. We have a speaker tonight who will be speaking partly, at least, to these. And these are, on the face of it, really welcoming and progressive. They call on schools to be welcoming. They urge teachers to adapt their curricula. They encourage staff to use a learner's preferred name and pronouns. They suggest teachers don't assume gender and not to use binary language if it is unhelpful. For example, they talk about traditions where young people line up according to boys versus girls. They recommend that schools provide toilets and changing rooms, which might be more inclusive. And they even mention the possibility of gender-neutral uniforms or a young person being allowed to choose their own particular uniform that they wish to wear. I think what is not clear, and maybe our speaker Likho could speak to this a little bit, is what do these guidelines say? And I realize there are limitations to guidelines. What do they say in the case of a young person who wants to start transitioning socially, but that they don't wish their parents to be involved? So these are the kinds of debates I hope we will surface tonight. In terms of our speakers, I'm going to introduce them all now and what they're going to talk about, and then invite each of them to make their presentations, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. So firstly, we've got Likho Bottoman, who's of the Department of Basic Education. Likho is a Director of Social Cohesion and Equity, and will be speaking to the guidelines and other advice that maybe could come from the DBE about managing this dilemma. Then we've got Stanley Malematja of the Center for Child Law from the University of Pretoria. Stanley is an admitted attorney and has a PG diploma in human rights litigation and advocacy from WITS. So Stanley will speak to the question of how one balances these different concerns and rights around consent. Then we've invited, we're going to shift the order slightly, Patricia Proctor, who's a parent of a trans teenager. Thank you, Patricia. We'll be speaking to her experience of going on that journey with your child and how you think about the question which we've posed tonight. I know that you'd shared with me earlier today some of your own reflections on that. After Patricia, we have Akani Shimange of Matimba, which is an NGO that works with trans and gender diverse youth. Akani is a human rights defender and founder of Matimba, and they have been involved in a number of research opportunities and publications around on the trans youth experience. And we're hoping, Akani, you can tell us a bit about what would a young person need in the context of this kind of ethical dilemma that I've posed. And then finally, we've got Prof. Anthony Brown from Stellenbosch University. Anthony is a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology and the departmental chair and coordinator of the MEd program. And I thought, Anthony, what you could bring to the conversation is something about managing the classroom from the perspective of a teacher who's working with this kind of diversity. But I think we should allow our speakers to be a little bit flexible and bring issues that they think are important to the conversation tonight. So if there are no further practical matters to discuss, we can jump straight into your presentation and or discussion. Likho, welcome.
Thank you very much, Pierre.
Yes.
You will notice that I'm using two devices because
yes.
I am a South African. I live in a context of load shedding. The device that connects to my Wi-Fi is the one that is giving me trouble. So I'm using this one now connecting to the phone, and I hope that you don't mind just receiving an audio from me without the video, because I was hoping to show the video and I was hoping to share a couple of slides to support the presentation that I'm making today. Is that fine?
That's fine. We feel your pain, Likho. I'm so sorry about it. We're all battling devices and backup plans, but welcome anyway. We look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, let me start by saying that the issue of diverse sexual and gender identities in the Department of Basic Education in South Africa is receiving a lot of attention lately. And this is because we realize that there are some deficits in terms of the recognition of the rights of the child when it comes to these issues in South Africa. We have seen quite a number of children that are ostracized, that are discriminated against, that are met with prejudice on a daily basis as they go to school. Whereas the legislative and policy framework of this country is saying that all are equal and all are welcome to learn. But that hasn't been the experience, particularly for children with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And we, as much as we live in a democratic country in South Africa, we know that we do have some dissident groupings in our country who think that these are unimportant issues and that the basic education sector has got no business meddling on these issues. In fact, I was saying to Professor Brown when we started to do this work that it's surprising that the very same people whom we trust as individuals and as officials, they themselves need a little bit of transformative education when it comes to these issues, because one of them has once said to me as we were placing the idea of developing these guidelines on the table, that why are we forcing this matter? Why don't we wait until these children are in post-school education? Then they can make their choices when they get there. Are we not afraid that we are going to make schools ungovernable by introducing this kind of knowledge and this way of doing things?
I think the ungovernable Leak has
Sorry, I think I got.
You did. You got briefly cut off.
Yeah.
You were saying about that aren't we making schools ungovernable?
Yes, you see. So that was coming from somebody whom is entrusted with the responsibility to ensure that the law is upheld, that governance and leadership is going accordingly in schools. But that's what they were saying. But Pierre, it gets worse. Hey, the person then also then says to me, otherwise it becomes ungovernable because if they want to come in as giraffe or they want to come in as Pink Panther, you are going to allow them to come in as whatever. And how are you going to manage all of that? So immediately then I thought that, a transformative kind of education is required because we need to educate those that are gatekeepers, that are key holders, that are torchbearers in this work so that they're able to position it properly. Because if you're going to compare this work with an idea that a child is coming in a costume at a school, then it means then you haven't quite worked out what gender identity is, what gender expression is, what sexual orientation is, and what sex characteristics are. But ironically, as I'm sitting in this virtual room today, I've had my own share yesterday where, again, a highly qualified and a person of high authority in the DPE is asking me about why I have to state my pronouns in my email signature. So I explained because I thought it's an innocent question that is being posed to me. Maybe they're being exposed for the first time. I know I was also, when I was exposed for the first time, when Akani and them who are on this panel were using their pronouns, I was like, oh, but it's given. But, as we were going along, I realized that, no, actually, it's not given. So without making presumptions about people's gender identities, it's important that we state what our pronouns are. And I pointed this person out to progressive corporate practices where now people are beginning to do that in their email signatures. But also for me, Pierre, as you can hear, I've got quite a feminine voice, whatever that means, but this is what he said. Likho, you've got a feminine voice. It's easy for us to confuse you, with a woman because we think, so they call me ma'am, they call me miss, they call me all sorts of things. And it becomes awkward when I have to correct that on the spot in a formal meeting and all. So I think it's important for me to have this pronoun. And the response, Pierre, that I got from that colleague of mine was that I personally feel that you're misrepresenting the DBE. I personally feel that you're misusing your office. That's what they said. So clearly, whilst we're developing guidelines, for schools, the transformative work is going to need to start with us as the administrators, as the policymakers, and then it goes to teachers, school management teams, and school governing bodies before we can get to learners. So we've got a long way to go. Our guidelines are really just meant to create an ethos of inclusivity in schools, particularly to provide the support that needs to be provided to learners that come into our schools with diversity or diverse identities. But ultimately, what we need to do together as the people who are in this room today and those who are watching and those who will be listening to this webinar and everyone else who comes into the space, we need to be patient with this system. We can see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. In the working group for social inclusion, which drafted these guidelines, we thought that when we went in, we are going to fight and we're going to, protest. We are going to do all sorts of things to ensure that there's recognition. But the colleagues in that working group are all unanimously saying that we're not going to go anywhere if we fight. Let's rather transform, let's rather educate, let's rather empower so that all of us are singing from the same page, because we realize that although we've got the same constitution, although we've got the same legislative and policy frameworks in education, they don't apply the same in all our lives, especially when people are able to bring forward their own biases and judgments into the mix. Then it all becomes a problem. But as much as we know that we've got the curriculum that we need to transform, which we are in the process of transforming through the scripted lesson plans for comprehensive sexuality education and the work that we do around gender responsive pedagogy for early childhood education. There's a whole deal of work that is happening at the moment in curriculum to transform curriculum so that it remains ready to tackle these issues that it never used to tackle before. We know that we are also going to need to focus on teacher training and teacher development, which is the second issue. The teacher training and teacher development is very important because it means then that if we expect teachers to be carers and supporters of children with SOGIAS identities, it means then that we need to train them up. We need to support them with knowledge and skills to be able to do that. The third thing that I want to mention there is around learning and teaching support materials and textbooks. Just about 4 or 5 years ago, we did some work where we reviewed our textbooks and LTSM, learning and teaching support materials, so that we evaluate them for any prejudices that may be perpetuated by the content, the learning content that we put out there. And we realize that, our material is very heteronormative. It's biased towards heterosexuality. It's biased towards nuclear families, and all of those things. And so these are the things we need to fix in the system. The fourth thing that I want to mention is that we therefore also need to ensure that in the core curricular space, we also need to infiltrate that to ensure that we are able to, reposition the delivery of extracurricular programming so that learners with SOGIAS identities feel that they are a part of it and that they can freely participate. But the last thing is on IEC material, information, education, and communication materials, which is what the guidelines are trying to really to reinforce, including policy there. These guidelines are going to assist us to ensure that schools are not caught wanting. Because at the moment, Pierre, if you go to a school and there's a child either of transgender identity or who has got a diverse sexual orientation, schools up to today don't know what to do to support that child. They call all sorts of people, and some of the speakers who are here on the panel will tell you about the calls that come in where schools are needing to be supported. And sometimes we all feel like, oh, but a school should be naturally empowered to deal with this. You don't have to call a Professor Brown or an Akani or somebody to do this because it's there. It's in your law. It's in your policy standards for educators or for principals, or, it's there. But we realize that we can't take it for granted that it is there in the law and that schools are able to apply it. So basically the guidelines, what they will try and do is to pull in all the provisions of the law and of policy that exist everywhere and combine them and converge them into one instrument that would be the guidelines, so that schools don't feel or are not found to be, to be wanting, or they don't feel like they have to call people to come in and assist them, but they've got an instrument that is there, that assists them, that guides them. Now, the question that comes here that I have to deal with every day is saying that if it's guidelines and it's not a policy, then it means that schools have got a choice to implement them or not. And that is not true. The truth actually is that the reason why schools are doing what they like at the moment, it's because we haven't provided the guidelines. Once we provide the guidelines, then it means that all the beneficiaries now who were told not to fight, but to embark on a transformative journey with us, will now begin to activate the fighting gear. And once they do, that school will not be supported by the Department of Basic Education, because the Department of Basic Education will also ask, together with the judge or the magistrate, what guide did you use to deal with this case? Because we, as basic education have provided a guide to you that you can use. And so if you've dealt with a case outside of the premise and the provisions of the guidelines, a school will have to answer for themselves. So particularly those schools that are led by quite conservative school governing bodies are going to have to answer for themselves which guide they used, because as far as we understand, the guide will be out. In addition, the issue of codes of conduct is no longer a matter that arises where people can hide behind. You can't say, our code of conduct says this and that and that. Look here, 5 or 6 years ago, when the issue of code of conduct was a thing in this country about Afro for girls, we took a decision as a sector and as a country that codes of conduct are not cast in stone. When we discover that our code of conduct is not in line with the policies, or it is not human rights compliant, a school is compelled to immediately review that code of conduct and to ensure that the code of conduct becomes human rights compliant. So you can't say your hands and feet are tied. You can't deal with the case of a soldier's identity in school because your code of conduct is saying this and the guidelines are still in draft form. They are being consulted with and so forth. There is nowhere to hide, colleagues. Schools are going to have to assist our children because this education system is designed for all of us. So with those words, Pierre, I really want to say thanks for inviting us. I'm looking forward to hearing how my other colleagues are going to enrich this discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing from colleagues what they can offer as support, because it can really be a lonely journey for me in particular, and especially when you're hearing the things I have to hear from people who are supposed to assist me internally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Likho. We feel your pain. I feel your pain. You know, working in this space is hard and lonely work, and we need each other to support each other, because you know you hear all kinds of shocking stuff when you're involved in workshops or meetings, and I'm realizing that my presumption when setting up this dilemma for tonight around, which was that there was a supportive teacher who wanted to work with a gender diverse child perhaps in conflict with a parent, it has already assumed so much, because I think in most cases, probably in South Africa, the teachers are confused, uncertain, and maybe carry some of the unconscious and conscious bias that you've already articulated. And certainly I know from other work that I've done in the life orientation and CSE space that even though, you know, schools are meant to provide it and should provide well-trained LO teachers who are confident with a range of issues, the truth is, in fact, often quite far from that. So I think these guidelines are really, really important, and we appreciate them very much. So, I mean, I know that you're facing an uphill battle, but in this small community that is present tonight, you're in a safe space of people who really, really believe in what you're doing and support your work. So thank you for that. We can go to you next, Stanley. If you could give us some sense of the question of what are sort of perhaps the competing rights that might be existing in a school context. And I know, for example, the idea that parents don't have absolute rights over every decision for their children. For example, there's precedent around, I think I recall a case some years ago, a refusal to give a child a life-saving blood transfusion, for example. The state was stepped in. So you know, very few rights are absolute. And I'm sure that you're going to be saying that kind of thing in your presentation. So welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my presentation. Share. Is it appearing in there?
Yes, it is. If you could just open your slides from the start, we're good to go.
Is it appearing in full?
In full. Thanks, Stanley.
Okay. Let me just minimize my screen so that I can see my presentation. Again, good evening to the colleagues, and thank you for this wonderful platform to discuss, an issue that does not have a silver bullet answer. And I mean, as Likho has already alluded, that even those who are supposed to be protecting the children or having a better understanding of this topic, they seem to be lost, or they seem to be naive. So I'm just, in my presentation, what I'm going to touch on in a large format is basically the rights of the child from an international perspective, watering down to the domestic perspective, so that we get to understand what rights children are entitled to. Then we'll then spin over to the rights of the parents when it comes to issues such as consent, and largely on the topic of the sexual orientation of children. So I will kickstart. So I think to begin with, I think what is important is that we need to acknowledge that children are entitled to all the fundamental human rights which are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, except those which are specifically reserved for adults, such as the right to vote. And of great importance is for us to have a glance into Section 9 of the Constitution. And I've selected, specific provisions under Section 9. And if you look at Section 9, subsection 2, it speaks about, the equality to the full and equal enjoyment of all the rights and freedoms. Now, we need to understand that children are also entitled to these rights, and that they are not only entitled to the rights provided for under Section 28 of the Constitution, which I will touch later on. And also, when we talk about the Bill of Rights, and especially the equality clause, there we also find, conducts which are prohibited, conducts which the state or any other person cannot, or that they are prohibited from committing, For example, Section 9, subsection 3 prohibits unfair discrimination by the state on the grounds of gender and sexual orientation. And if we look further down at subsection 4 of Section 9, it prohibits unfair discrimination by any person on the grounds of gender or sexual orientation. And it is very important that one appreciates the wording of the Constitution, especially words such as any person. This includes the parent, it includes the guardian, it includes the caregiver, it includes the teacher, it includes the neighbor, the scholar, transport driver. All these persons, they are prohibited from discriminating against the child, if I can add that word into this provision, to discriminate against the child on the grounds of gender or sexual orientation. If we look further down at Section 9, subsection 5, this one provides for discrimination. Basically, what it says is that discrimination on the basis of gender and sexual orientation is unfair unless established otherwise. So the position here is that once a child is being discriminated against, or once any person is being discriminated against, either by the state or by any person on the basis of gender and or sexual orientation, that discrimination is prima facie unfair unless if it can be established otherwise. And we know that when it's established otherwise, one has to be satisfied that the discrimination passes the constitutional muster as provided for in the limitation clause in Section 36 of the Constitution. When I was preparing for this presentation, I came across a passage in one of my favorite constitutional court judgments in the case of S versus M. And I just had to quote it verbatim because of how it neatly fits into the topic of today, and particularly around children's rights and their right to sexual orientation or gender. And here Justice Sachs pens as follows and says, individually and collectively, all children have the right to express themselves as independent social beings, to have their own laughter as well as their own sorrow, to play, imagine, explore in their own way, to themselves, to get to understand their bodies, minds, and emotions, and above all, to learn as they grow how they should conduct themselves and make choices of the wide social and moral world of adulthood. So, this case is very important, in that it touches on the individual autonomy of children, the right of the child to experience themselves as an independent social being, to get to understand their mind and to get to understand their bodies without any hindrance, either from the state or from any other person. Moving further, touching on to the international framework. Now, what I found quite amazing, especially from these two international frameworks that I've included in my presentation, the first being the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, if we look at Article 2, it places a duty on South Africa as a state party to ensure that children are protected against any form of discrimination based on gender or any other status. But what I found to be rather concerning is that the United Nations on the Rights of the Child is not explicit on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So they don't, this international treaty does not have the phrase or the words rather sexual orientation. However, and I will explain to it further, it's not much of a hurdle or much of a problem, and I will explain later why I say so. Now, again, if we look at the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, Article 3, entitles, every child to the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms recognized and guaranteed in the Charter, irrespective of the child or his or her parents' legal guardian's race, ethnic group, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, fortune, birth, or other status. And again, like the UNCRC, the African Charter is also not explicit on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender. Now, if we look at Section 28 of the Constitution, which is both a right in itself and also a principle, this is the best interest of the child. And what Section 28, subsection 2, tells us is that the best interest of the child are of paramount importance in every matter concerning the child. Now, if we were to give Article 2 of the UNCRC and Article 3 of the African Charter, respectively, if we were going to give them a broader expansion or a broader interpretation when it comes to discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, one can, gladly, agree that Section 28, subsection 2, and also the wording in the respective international treaties, particularly the words other status, one can safely, open it to an interpretation that sexual orientation is included as a ground of non-discrimination against a child. Now, moving further, we also have the Children's Act, which makes provision for the rights of children, and also makes provision, most importantly, for the care and well-being of children. And if we look at Section 9 of the Children's Act basically echoes Section 28, subsection 2 of the Constitution, and it provides further that the standard of the best interest of the child is of paramount importance, and that this standard must always be applied in every matter concerning the child. Moving further, we have Section 7 of the Children's Act. And Section 7 basically tells us what constitutes the standard of the best interest of the child. And I've picked some examples here, as you can see on the screen, or decided to pick some provisions which speak to what constitutes the best interest of the child standard. And if you look at it, we have the child's physical and emotional security, which also includes the child's intellectual and emotional and social and cultural development, and it also speaks, Section 7, or rather the provisions of Section 7 also speak to the need of the child to be protected from any physical or psychological harm which may be caused by subjecting the child to maltreatment, ill treatment, violence, or any other harmful behavior. And I think, this can be used as a stepping stone, towards, ensuring that schools gender inclusive, so that we avoid merely just integrating children into harmful situations which might expose them to ill treatment or violence based on their sexual orientation or gender. And Pierre, just to touch, when I looked at the concept note, I was very excited to see the inclusion of consent, and how the concept note read consent, particularly in terms of medical and surgical treatment. And this, although it doesn't per se have a direct link with sexual orientation or gender, it is very important as another guiding block to say that what needs to be taken into account when a child, for example, or a learner approaches a teacher and start giving the teacher information about his or her sexual orientation or gender. Now, we need to appreciate the age, the level of maturity, and the development of the child, right? Because this will help us to gauge whether this child, if we look at Section 129, subsection 2, paragraph A of the Children's Act, it will be able to guide us to gauge whether this child has the mental capacity and the sufficient maturity to understand the benefits, risks, and social and other implications that comes with them giving such an information to a teacher or a school, especially where that child says, please do not give this information to my parents or any other teachers in the school. Now, we have touched on children's rights, and now I want to come to parental rights and linking that with consent. Up to how far do parents hold the prerogative and the right to consent to situations which involve their children? And if we look at the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, particularly Article 18, it speaks about parental responsibility for the upbringing of a child. And it says further that it is the primary responsibility of the parent to ensure the upbringing and development of the child. However, or adding to that, the best interest of the child will be the basic concern. It means that although the parent holds the primary responsibility to ensure the upbringing and development of their child, the best interest of that child shall be of paramount importance, or shall be or will be the basic concerns. Now, as Likho was presenting, you'd say that they had sight of my presentation beforehand, because I posed this question to say, do parents understand and appreciate what entails the best interest of their children? Although they have the primary responsibility to ensure their upbringing and development, do they appreciate do they appreciate what entails the best interest of their children? Moving further to the African Charter, looking particularly at Article 20, it also echoes the same sentiments or the same provision as Article 18 of the UNCRC. So I will not repeat what it says. Then we also have in our domestic legal framework, again, the Children's Act, particularly Section 18, which provides for parental responsibilities and rights. And here it mentions specifically that a parent's consent is required by law. And it goes further, to provide examples of where the law would require parental consent in matters, affecting the child, and this would include adoption or the departure or the relocation of a child from the Republic. And again, the Children's Act is also silent when it comes to, consent issues of the parent in relation to their children's sexual orientation or gender. Now, let us look into the legal position of schools and teachers. And looking at the South African Schools Act, I've again selected two provisions. Section 3. Now, Section 3 places an obligation on a parent to ensure that a child of school-going age attends school. So there's a legal obligation on a parent to ensure that their child, if they are of a school-going age, to ensure that that child attends school. If we look at Section 5, it places a duty on the Department of Education or public schools to admit learners and serve their educational requirements without unfairly discriminating in any way. Now, there are existing factors which cause parents to choose a particular school for their child, and those factors can include disability, affordability, and the proximity of the school to the home or to the parent's workplace. Now, essentially, a child or a learner has very little to no control in terms of the school which they are placed, as this decision is mainly taken by the parent or guardian. Sitting here, most of us, I, for one, I don't remember participating in the decision of which primary school I'm going to attend up until high school, until I finished matric. All I saw at the beginning of every school year was either a new uniform or an old uniform, and I'm taken to the school. So I had no control whatsoever to say, this is the type of school that I want to. All those decisions were taken by my parents. Now, in South Africa, we still have schools which are designated for boys and girls only. And again, it is the decision of parents or guardians pushed by those factors that I listed above to place their children in the schools. And quite frankly, the sexual orientation of the child is seldom, if at all, considered when a parent or guardian seeks placement in a particular school for their children. So again, children do not participate. Their sexual orientation is not taken into account in terms of what school they are placed in. And this is why we would come across issues such as a child confiding to a teacher, the school, about their sexual orientation or gender, and having the school, as Likho alluded earlier, having the school or the teachers themselves not knowing how to address that situation. So now let's look at information protection insofar as sexual orientation or gender of a child or a learner is concerned. Now, it is a general practice in our schools that teachers or the school bear the responsibility to inform parents or guardians about the progress of their children and the status of the school. And this may include, the discussion of the child's sexual orientation or gender. Now, in a situation where a child does not consent to the school informing the parents about his or her or their sexual orientation, then the school bears that responsibility not to give out such information to the parents or guardian. But this is not an easy task. It is not an easy task at all, because there are situations where the school might be compelled to divulge such information in efforts to protect the child. So how does the school do it? The school needs to always be guided by what is in the best interest of that learner or that child. And once the best interest of that learner or that child becomes the guiding principle insofar as information protection is concerned, then that information again must be shared in a manner that is consistent with the best interest of the child. Because the best interest of the child is not only a fundamental human right, it is also a principle and a guiding standard to ensure that every decision that is to be taken and which that decision involves or concerns a child, the child's best interest must be of paramount importance. Now, without for a lack of a better word, without posing as if I am coming with solutions, but some of the things that can work and some of the methods that can work in terms of information protection is that schools must try and engage the available services, such as those of a social worker or a psychologist, so as to ensure that the well-being of the child or learner, including their social, psychosocial, intellectual, and emotional well-being, is safeguarded, and that this child is not victimized either by that information being withheld by the school or by the manner in which the school decides to share that information with the parents or the guardian of the child. Now, where information, I'm presenting here another issue, and basically that where the information is not shared with the parent or guardian, this may hinder the exercise of parental responsibilities and rights and further prohibit that parent or guardian to act in line with what is in the best interest of their child, and further hinder that parent or guardian from providing the necessary support for that child. So, okay, that is the end of it. Let me just stop sharing and come back to the screen. So basically, in a nutshell, my presentation does not, pretend to be bringing up solutions, but what I'm basically saying is that we need to be guided by the relevant principles and laws that are already in existence, especially those speaking to the children's rights, and further expand or broaden our interpretation and understanding of what it entails, or what the best interest of the child principle entails. And I think that once we are in that in that avenue, we will be better positioned to ensure that we ensure the protection of these children, we ensure that they are not victimized, we ensure that they receive the necessary support, And, you know, most importantly, that judgment, the S versus M case, we need to appreciate and understand that children are not a small version or a tiny version of their parents. They are not umbilically connected to swim or drown with their parents, and that children have their own personality. And just to wrap up, Pierre, as you said earlier on, that, you know, there are people who come on the platform and say there is this narrative that people are pushing to try and say these children must be confused, or people do not understand. People are still treating children as if their personalities are those of their parents. No, children have their own personality. Allow children to explore themselves, to explore their bodies, to explore their minds, so that in the future, there are those adults which understand this issue that is before us, because as Likho said earlier on, we have adults and professionals who do not understand this very important topic that we are grappling with. I thank you very much for the platform, colleagues.
Thank you, Stanley. I'm just going to jump in. I see Pierre has just dropped into darkness there. So I'll give Pierre a moment to catch up. But thanks, Stanley. I just put a comment in the chat. Thank you so much for that very nuanced and focused journey through, I think, the very pertinent, you know, aspects of the legislative framework that speaks directly to our conversation this evening. It's appreciated. Pierre, you back?
Yes, my load shedding kicked in, but my plans B worked. What people didn't know is that I privately had messaged Stanley saying you've got 5 minutes left, and he stuck to the 5 minutes left. So thank you for that. I think you did a fantastic job. I didn't hear what your comment was, Ron, but in framing the dilemma, and I think really making it clear that there isn't a blanket answer to the question I posed at the beginning of tonight's discussion, but it probably would be on a case-by-case basis. If this ever came to a court, for example, there would be a weighing up of the interests of the child versus the responsibilities of the school and of the parents. But I love the LB Sachs quote. Thank you for that, because I think it really reminded us that these young people are whole beings that need our and had to have that acknowledged. So thank you for that. We'll go to you next, Akani. If you could give us some of your own reflections. I think you do have a PowerPoint, and you can start sharing that now.
Thank you, Pierre.
Pleasure.
I'm just checking if everyone can see my presentation.
Yep, it's looking good to me. Thank you.
Thank you. So my presentation is kind of grounding the conversation in the children that we're speaking about, and through the work I do. So for everyone who has not met me, I've met most of the people in this call. I am Akani Shimange. My pronouns are they and them. So I co-create spaces for trans and gender diverse youth, like support spaces, safety spaces, also for their parents and for educators in different schools. I do a lot of work around trans-inclusive policy development for schools and a number of multinationals. Currently, I do advocacy in 3 regions: Africa, Asia, and South America, dealing with issues at the intersection of queerness and faith. And I am the parent of a 7-year-old child who plays around with gender a number of times. I say that because I think it's always interesting when I have this conversation that people feel that I can speak like this because my interests are not vested in a child that I know. And sometimes I think it's important to kind of disclose that. I also want us to kind of ground ourselves in what the question was, right? Because I've noticed when we say the word trans, people tend to lose the conversation because of the amount of fear-mongering that has been done around the conversation. So I need us to remember what was asked. If a child wanted to socially transition, And the definition for socially transitioning is basically the process by which a transgender child or an adolescent adopts the name, pronoun, and gender expression, such as clothes, haircut, that matches their gender identity. So basically, in the lamest version of this is that, so Natasha, who you understand to be a girl, therefore uses she, her pronouns, and is supposed to be comfortable. I mix those two up. This shows how much I don't believe in gender, but is supposed to be comfortable in a skirt, says to you, hi, please call me Akani, use he, him pronouns, and don't give me attention for wearing pants because that's what makes me comfortable. That's it. This is what this child has asked, right? But the issue is that when we have conversations around transgender children, we conflate gender identity, sexual orientation, and sex characteristics, right? These are three very different things. And so this is how people end up in the conversation around age-appropriate questions, because fear-mongering somehow feeds off this idea of us teaching children sexual practices, which people want to relate to sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is not just sexual practice, but that's what they do. That's not the conversation we're actually having, right? And we're not people don't try to have a nuanced conversation around why these terms have been put together, but actually mean totally different things. So gender identity has nothing to do with sexual orientation, technically. People are conscious of their gender identity at birth. And we established this consciousness by asking any cisgender person, when did they know they were a boy or girl? They usually all go, I've always known, right? So when we speak of transgender children, age appropriateness becomes a very weird question to ask because we never ask cis people what age they would have known. So trans people may not be able to articulate at an early age that they're trans because we're born into a society that doesn't teach us, nor does it hold the space for gender pluralism, right? So you're told you're a boy over and over and over again. And if you're told something by people you trust, you tend to start believing it, right? So I just wanted us to root this conversation and actually what we're talking about, right? And so the responsibility of teachers, their primary responsibility is children, right? And I say this because I had to think about this when I read the concept that if my child said to their teacher that they were trans, would I want to know? My default answer was yes. But I had to then sit with it and be like, why am I invading their privacy, right? What is making them more comfortable to tell their teacher and not me? So in that space, the teacher must trust that the child is making this choice with reason. So I think a lot of what has been mentioned tonight will be part of the things I will speak to. So around the best interest of the child, that standard is very important. And I think it becomes kind of difficult to weigh into it when it often has to weigh up two things. Do I not say this as a teacher? And there's repercussions. And the parents show up and they're angry and I have somehow done something wrong. Or do I say it, which there is a minority of parents who will abuse their children for being trans, right? And so do I say this and that happens? How do I hold these two spaces? So I think the thing is there has to be determining questions, right? So how do we determine the interests of the child? What does the child want? If the child is asking to use a different name in this space, I don't think there's a huge issue. Most people, most children, I went to school, my full name was too hard for my teacher to use. They use name. So most children don't actually use their full names in schools, right? So the child is asking for a different name. They're asking to be affirmed in this space. And this does not harm anyone, right? What does the child need? If the child is speaking around medically transitioning, And that is a conversation that needs to be had with parents. But if the child is speaking around socially transitioning, they're saying this social space feels safe for me. This is where I would like to explore gender, right? So also weighing up, what does divulging this information mean for this child? Are they safe? Can you fully guarantee that they are safe? Because we also understand that people are different people in different spaces. So can I fully know that a parent is safe for this child? I can't. I don't fully understand the context in which this child lives in. What I understand is this child is saying, I want you to hold this information for me, right? And how do we create that safe space? Does a child want the parents to know? And usually children do not want the parents to know until they have fully understood what they need to articulate, because there is inherently the space where children feel that until they can actually explain what is happening, the amount of what they're processing and having their parents process with them might not be something they can hold. So secondly, the child in this situation, being the most important one, being the one that needs all the adults around them to basically protect them. So I was going to reference the Convention of the Rights of Children, which South Africa has ratified. So it speaks around equality and non-discrimination. So this child should definitely have access to education, and education that is affirming in spaces where they're seen, which should allow them to use bathrooms in which they are comfortable, which should allow them to wear a uniform that speaks to them, right? They also have the right to privacy and dignity. And that means not bullying them, not using this against them, not holding this over them, protecting them in that space, but also giving them the privacy to process this moment in their life in a space where they feel safe and in ways that they feel safe. So this was my idea of speaking to how a lot of trans people process gender. And this is not linear, nor are trans people a monolith, right? So we explore gender, and this is something I think we know about all human beings. All human beings explore gender at some point of their life, right? Then we gather information. And as we gather this information, the example being a lot of trans people come out and they're like, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, because they're exploring that, right? Non-binary being an umbrella term. And within that, they might be agender, or they might be bigender, or they might be a number of genders, right? But also there are trans people who come out and say, I'm trans, and they haven't figured out what that means in like the full expression of gender, right? So they gather that information, and then being able to name the experience is important, and then owning their identity. So owning it being that they're disclosing to the teacher, being that they're ready to disclose to their parents. And usually a number of people come in during all of this, right? And most of the time, the person you go to first is A, a safe space, but B, a space where you believe you can find information. So it's important for teachers to understand that in this moment, this child is asking for support and is not asking for them to go disclose. So the basic approach that I usually speak to adults, not just teachers, but adults around children who you may be the aunt, you may be the cousin, who this child approaches firstly, is have empathy in this conversation, right? Do not expect that child to have full answers. Do not be empathetic and understand that as a child, you're not supposed to go against your parents. And this is what parents usually teach you. And then all of a sudden, there's this thing that goes against all societal norms that you have grown to understand, and you're trying to explain it. Secondly, be supportive. Asking the child what they need. How do you show up for them? Do they need to talk more often? Do they need space where they could read things? Do they, etc.? Giving them all the information you have, and allowing them to bounce information off you. I always joke that trans people are the best researchers in the world. We tend to find information about our experiences in all these spaces, because usually this information is not readily available for us, and ensuring that that child has safety. So the reality, so these are the experiences that exist on both these sides, but the current reality of trans kids in schools is pretty bleak, right? So we have guiding principles, we have the CRC, we have the Constitution, and currently we have the guidelines that are being drafted. But the experiences currently of trans children is that governments and schools have not seen this as an urgent issue, right? So, and I say this with the understanding of that these guidelines are important and they need input, etc. But I also highlight this a lot, that the conversation around these guidelines started approximately 5 years ago. When a particular child was in grade 7, that child has since dropped out of school. So the delay of these guidelines, the delay of policies, unfortunately means, and us not fighting and doing this quietly and smoothly and nicely, basically means that trans and gender diverse children will be the casualties of this. The amount of trans and gender diverse children that are dropping out of schools, that are, if they have access, end up being homeschooled, that are needing mental health support because of the ways in which schools are not being told how they should treat these children, and that these children should be treated like every other child, unfortunately has led to a huge number of children who are suffering and continuously choosing not to go to school, which education is supposed to be a basic human right, right? So I wanted to speak on this, but Likho has said guidelines are close to policy. I do, in my understanding, is that guidelines are a reference, and this is why schools have always had a guideline around uniform that has not said that uniform is gendered, but schools have had the right to decide what that looks like. And that has landed us in this moment where schools are like, that is a guideline, it is a reference, it guides us, but it is not mandatory, right? And we worry that guidelines will not ensure that trans children have safe access to education, right? Trans children know and feel that they're discussed in meetings. And I say this because I've been invited to a number of meetings. And imagine being a child in a school with 500 students, and there's literally a meeting in a hall being called about your identity and being very specific around you being in school. These children tend to choose to drop out of those schools because they are now the focus of so many things, right? They are bullied by teachers. A number of children have highlighted that they're used as examples in classes, and they're bullied by other parents. And so I would invite, honestly, DBE and teachers and other parents to figure out what it looks like to keep these children safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Akani. I think you've asked the tough questions which need to be asked. And you did exactly what I hoped you would do, which is to center the young trans or gender diverse person in the story tonight. So thank you for doing that. I think that it's given me certainly things to think about. Having been involved in my own university in a kind of guideline process around trans and gender diverse folk, I've come very much to that point that I think you raise around, well, what is the status of these guidelines or protocols, or what is their weight? Are they enforceable? Because I think, as the point you make, that is, if they're optional, that doesn't in the end make the world safe for young trans folk. And also here, I guess, Likho, maybe you would bring this in the discussion, is the challenge on the other side of getting complex, contested guidelines and such documents through the many years of processes of approval can be soul-destroying as well. And I certainly thought when you spoke earlier, your fatigue and somewhat occasional disillusionment, I think, popped up. So we acknowledge that these issues are complex. But thank you, Akani.